Welcome everyone to Raise the Roof. Today my partner Leroy Hill and I are joined by Alex Fogarty to offer a biblically sound and philosophically robust discussion of Alfred Kinsey's 1948 book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. We'll show how Kinsey, along with his associates W.D. Pomeroy and C.E. Martin, reshaped America's moral landscape and deformed our view of male sexuality. Let me kick things off with a little background. Kinsey began as a biologist studying gall wasps, but in the 1940s, he redirected his research towards the human animal and our sexuality. To this day, he's praised as a trailblazer, but Christians, alongside many secular scholars, recognize that his research wasn't just biased, it was bad. Encyclopedia Britannica points out Kinsey's methodological flaws, but describes Kinsey's work in one of the most sanitized and anodyne ways possible. Quote, sexual behavior in the human male created a sensation, they write, although it was intended for professional readership and was largely statistical in format. In the year of its publication, it ranked fourth among non-fiction bestsellers in the United States. The studies have since been widely criticized for sampling irregularities and because of the often unreliable nature of personal interviews. What a tragic understatement from what should be a reliable source of information, like Encyclopedia Britannica. Kinsey's work wasn't just irregular, it was ethically disastrous. Both his 1948 book about male sexuality that we'll explore today in the show and his 1953 book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, have poisoned the well of human sexuality in the West. The problem begins with Kinsey's so-called sampling irregularities. Kinsey claimed to be studying the average American male, but his sample was anything but average. He relied heavily on volunteers from prisons, reformatories, and sexually deviant subcultures far outside the experience of the typical American male. He blended answers from this outlier group into a fictional representation of male sexuality across the United States, creating a distorted picture that he presented as normal. His conclusions weren't neutral science. They weren't science at all. What they were is a reflection of the deviant lifestyle of the people Kinsey listened to. But setting aside his bad science, Kinsey's deepest failure was in his choice to experiment on children. Kinsey included detailed data on so-called sexual responses from infants and young boys, data that came from men who were actively abusing children. His infamous Table 34, for example, records timed orgasms of babies and toddlers, which was information supplied by pedophiles. Kinsey's research used more than 800 children, some as young as 5 months old. But instead of condemning the abuse, intervening, or alerting authorities, Kinsey and his colleagues who advanced these ideas treated these sexual crimes as morally neutral clinical observations. Their abuse was documented and even celebrated to justify the normalization of sexual perversion into the culture. The impact on public policy was significant. The ages of consent were lowered, as were the penalties for rape. And so-called sex education in the public schools eventually relied on this data to indoctrinate generations of children. Kinsey changed the national conversation about sexuality, but he did it by denying sin, normalizing brokenness, relying on the testimony of offenders, and ignoring the suffering of children. His work wasn't just scientifically questionable, it was morally compromised from the ground up. So, with that sort of downer of an introduction, but an honest assessment of what Kinsey's work is, let's bring in the guys, Alex and Leroy, to discuss the content a little more deeply. Gentlemen, welcome. Leroy, always good to see you. Alex, we've never had you on the show before, but you are a great guest to have on. We both have some good history with you. And so tell everyone a little bit about who you are, what they should know about you, why you agreed to come on and do this show with us.
My name is Alex Fogarty. I'm an active duty major in the United States Air Force. I'm stationed at the Pentagon working on AI policy for the Department of the Air Force. I'm an F-16 career pilot by my career field, but graduated from the Academy in 2012 and then flew fighters for some years before the Air Force sent me to school to study ethics and AI. So I got a PhD in philosophy at the University of Oxford, and then now I'm at the Pentagon doing that staff work follow-on. Before my time at Oxford, I studied in correspondence for a master's degree in Christian philosophy at Southern California Seminary with Joe Miller as one of my professors and with Leroy Hill as one of my fellow students / TAs, actually. Leroy and I go way back. He's an old football coach of mine and mentor
He's an
and
old
longtime
football
friend.
coach. That's what we need to know.
That's right. He's an old football coach of mine back in high school. So we've known each other for going on 20 years now. Again, I am active duty, so anything I'm saying on here is just my views personally and from what I've learned from studying, and not necessarily reflective of the government. But that being said, I'm excited to be on here and excited to talk through this topic with these two fine gentlemen.
Yeah, well, it's good to have you, man. And I just want people to realize this that yes, it's impressive. Alex graduated from Oxford. That's awesome. But I actually got to be a reference for him and somehow that got him still accepted. I remember when you asked me, "Hey, would you be a reference for me to get in?" And I was like, "Are you sure that's going to help?" And I was convinced that was a bad idea, but somehow it still worked. I don't know. They still let
Yeah.
you in. So,
Well, bribery goes a long way. So,
yeah. That had to be it, man, because I'm not sure I helped, but it was still awesome. That's so cool that we get to have you. And last time we got to hang out was over at Cambridge. You came over to
yes,
say hi to me that was last year. We got to hang
that's right.
out.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a
Yeah.
good time. So I'm very thankful for both of these gentlemen's influence in the ways that they've done that, and for my time at Southern California Seminary. I'm glad to reconnect and talk about something pretty important.
Yeah, Leroy. So normally I always ask Leroy how he's doing. He always said fine, and then it's awkward silence. So instead of that, Leroy, tell us something we need to know really truly about the real Alex Fogarty. Tell us something. Tell us something
Okay.
that's important for everybody to know.
I've known Alex since he was 14 years old, and there's a lot I could say about Alex today. I'll tell you one story. I was coaching Alex in the shot put, and I remember Alex had made it to the state finals, not the finals, but the state competition. And I remember sitting in the pit coaching his technique, and he threw the ball, and then we put in this new thing, this new addition, and I'm sitting there looking at it, and is the heavy ball that usually fell probably about 2 feet short of where I was standing. And we put this flick in. And I remember as he threw the ball left his hand, and I'm sitting there looking at it like this and thinking to myself, that ball might hit me. Oh my gosh, that ball almost hit me.
Well, you might like to know I did get to throw a shot put for Oxford, and I remember a lot of Leroy's coaching tips coming back in the back of my mind as I'm doing practice. So,
Yeah.
so in
Well,
military terms, Leroy, that would mean Leroy is a force multiplier.
Yes.
yes, he is. He is a force multiplier. You motivated him to want to hit you with the ball, so he threw
Well,
it extra hard, and he envisioned your face right there, and said, "I will
Yes.
throw it at his head."
he probably wanted to do that because I played a trick on Alex just about every time I drove him home. Alex would put his football gear in my trunk, and he knew that if he put his football gear in my trunk, I would wait for him to get out of the car, and I'd pop the trunk, and I would
And
wait.
drive off.
And as soon as he reached for it, I would drive off, and it happened so
Yeah.
many times.
And you
And
always kept the back seat full, so I had to put it in the trunk. It was a game.
I thought to myself, will this boy never learn?
That's great stuff, guys. Hey, well, let's get down to the nuts and bolts of the book we need to talk about here. So, 1948, Alfred Kinsey switches his discipline from studying wasps to human sexuality, and he's got an agenda here as he's studying male sexuality. Later on, a bunch of years later, he wrote a book on female sexuality. But maybe one of you guys, maybe I'll start with you, Leroy. Can you set the stage for why this book is important in your mind? What's the significance historically where it's at? Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the book itself, maybe why it's significant. And then, Alex, if you have something to add to that, we'll come to you in terms of why people should care about this book in its historical sense.
Yeah, it's interesting in this very narrow way, not in the sense of its impact. Its impact has been incredible, but it's interesting to me in this very narrow way. I'm studying right now how people can hold ideas in their minds, some that reflect history, reality, yet at the same time equally hold other views in their minds as equally true that have no real mooring or real anchor in history, and hold both of these ideas as totally true. And what I find with Kinsey is that Kinsey is helping people believe in what I would call mythic thinking. right? And what do I mean by mythic thinking? These are ideas that people hold that they need to hold in order for reality to be shaped in a way in which they prefer. So I started asking myself as we were reading this, what was it about Kinsey's writings? Aside from all the scientific jargon, what is it about Kinsey's writing that people found compelling? Well, if you believe Kinsey, it removed moral guilt, it legitimized sexual autonomy, it promised freedom from Christian restraints, it reframed his ideas, reframed deviance as normal, and they replaced sin with instinct. In that sense, Kinsey's work gave people a way of living that was emotionally compelling and resolved their own internal tensions. So for me, Kinsey gave people a way to live in the world that was opposite of the way that the normal person lived in the world, and to be free from the guilt or restraints that they felt from living that way.
Mm. Yeah, we'll definitely delve into some of the quotes that he has, some reinforce some of those ideas as we unpack these worldview questions that we'll explore. Alex, any kind of framing you think is significant for people going in, maybe who haven't read the book, that they need to know about this, it's the context or the substance of it or the purpose of it that you think that would help them?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to know that Kinsey sees himself as reacting against a Victorian-esque view of sexuality, which, arguably speaking, was very viewed sexual activity as extremely taboo, pretty much of all types, rarely talked about at all. And so we kind of see this pendulum swing in multiple areas of society in that period of time. And so again, it's important to frame his work and his attitude as somewhat reactionary, and to probe a little bit deeper into what was he reacting against as the backdrop, because that really motivates his
Yeah.
approach. I'd also say that it's just I mean, we'll get into it, but he seems to sort of disavow any normative ethics except for the kind that he prefers. He'll talk about how it's wrong to put artificial limitations on sexual behavior, but where is this concept of right and wrong even coming from as an atheist and an empiricist? It's not altogether clear. So those are some good ideas to be thinking about as one were to approach him in his work.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We'll come back at the end to that Victorian approach to sexuality that, as far as advice for Christian men, I want to get to that idea, especially on the male view of sexuality and what he was really responding to versus what the reality of the Christian worldview would argue about male sexuality, especially. We won't get into the female sexuality. That's a different book that he had, but we'll focus in on that. But I think that's a really key point that I want us to come back to in the end for Christian men, how we should respond to Kinsey versus the culture and those issues. So,
Yeah, and
okay.
the only thing I was going to say there was, as much of a villain as one may paint Kinsey, it's worth asking, was there anything he had to say that was in any sense a good reaction against Victorianism at all? I'm not saying it was. I'm just saying it's good to like say, okay, it's a reactionary response. Is it all junk, or is there something deep, some kind of thread somewhere that's worth picking up? That way, it's if someone takes that approach, they're seen as a good faith interlocutor rather than just somebody who wants to paint him bad,
Yeah.
which I think is fair to paint him that way because I think his conclusions were dubious. But again, just the idea of being a good faith inquisitor.
Yeah, no, we'll definitely dive into that concept a little bit for sure. So let's start with our worldview analysis of this. And the challenge with a book like Kinsey is he's a practitioner, not a philosopher. So we don't really get a full-orbed sense of worldview or what his thinking is. But that's okay. We've done that before. We've looked at folks like Rousseau, and we've looked at others who really shaped his worldview, his view of things. So folks can dive back in for that deeper analysis to our main six worldview questions that we always kind of dive into. But for now, let's look into this idea of where did I come from? What happens when I die? Those are our two questions that are beginning and ending of life. So obviously for Kinsey, it's going to be this largely atheist or possibly agnostic perspective. There's not a God in the picture, that's for sure. And that shapes his view of really humanity, because those questions, how we answer it, depends on how we see fellow human travelers. Now, I want to bring in a couple quotes and get you guys to respond to this. What's really interesting, though, is that I don't know if you guys are able to read Weicker, or the book that we're kind of basing this off is Weicker's 10 Books That Screwed Up the World. This chapter he had is really interesting because there's no quotes in his entire chapter. And what he said was he wasn't allowed to quote Kinsey in the book, that he had written for permission to the publishers to quote the book. Probably, I guess, maybe longer quotes, maybe. It really seems weird that you don't normally need permission to quote a book, maybe because he had more extensive. But anyway, he had to rewrite the entire chapter without a single quote. So for me, what I'm doing, my way around it, I sent you guys an article yesterday published from the American Journal of Public Health from 2003, volume 93, number 6. I'll link that in the show notes. So that was an exhaustive quotation from him as a primary source. So my quotes are actually from a journal article that I'll be quoting from him. So maybe avoiding any of the publisher concerns about us using quotes, which seems weird. I don't even understand that. But anyway, I just saying that for my disclaimer. So here's one of the things he says. This sets the stage about, again, where did I come from? What happens when I die? But the nature of human and human behavior, according to Kinsey. He says this: until the extent of any type of human behavior is adequately known, it is difficult to assess its significance, either to the individuals who are involved or to society as a whole. And until the extent of the homosexual is known, it is practically impossible to understand its biological or social origins. It is one thing if we are dealing with the type of activity that is unusual, without precedent among other animals, and restricted to peculiar types of individuals within the human population. It is another thing if the phenomena of homosexuality, here he's saying, proves to be a fundamental part not only of human sexuality, but of mammalian patterns as a whole. So it's this idea, he says, quote, it is implied that every individual is innately, inherently either we'll get to the innate heterosexuality, homosexuality later about the human nature. But clearly his idea is that humans are just another kind of mammal. And so if we can observe behaviors, then that observation of what is more important than any moral claim of what is ought. So that human origins piece seems pretty critical to his assumptions of it in his study. So Leroy, let me jump into you first, and then we'll get Alex's take on that quote and that his assumptions about human nature and human origins.
Yes, starting points in your philosophical outwork or outlook is important. If you start with the idea that men are made in the image of God, and then we follow that all the way down, then what we get is a specific way in which men ought to live in the world, right? We're not just looking at what is and then trying to figure out what ought to be from what is. We've been told what we are and who we are, of our value and worth, and then how we ought to live in the light of that. But if you take Kinsey's perspective, starting from the fact that we are animals in a mammalian, continuous, as he would say, with the mammalian world, then your starting point is not merely that man is some special thing or some special creation different than other creations. Man is no different than the other creation. Therefore, any range of sexual activity or actions or activities that you see within the animal world are equally applied to men who live in the real world. And I think that's where Kinsey's beginning starting point is. And you can see how that cashes out in his particular philosophical perspective.
Yeah, Alex, come to you. What about that worldview starting point for Kinsey? Anything jump out to you and his assumptions?
Yeah, I mean, his assumptions appear to assume that what is necessarily ought. So the longstanding is ought distinction, and he finds out what is the case in nature, and really doesn't do any heavy lifting to show whether or not that ought to be the case, especially with human behavior. And so he just takes it on board without probing that question with any real depth, and that kind of really guides his whole exploration.
Yeah. Yeah. What I think is interesting is that assumption that humans are just an advanced mammal in some way really helps us understand his transition from studying gall wasps to humans. It wasn't a radical shift like that a lot of people think it was. Oh, he radically changed his field of study. Well, yeah, it's a big change, but I think for him it was this idea that I've studied the animal, the insect world. I've studied that. Now I can take what I've learned from that and apply it to humans. For him, that was the natural extension. If you understand the animal, you understand the human. That I think is that key assumption that he makes in that. And that's what really shaped his understanding of his goal here to try to normalize homosexuality as a normal functioning part of the animal world. Therefore, we shouldn't have any moral concerns about it. Matter of fact, here's a couple little quotes that set the stage for that. He says, the homosexual has been a significant part of human sexual activity ever since the dawn of history, primarily because it is an expression of capacities that are basic to the human animal. So there he ties it in. And then another place he writes, it is implicit that every individual is innately, inherently either heterosexual or homosexual. Now, this is the part where he's analyzing the culture, like you brought up earlier, Alex. He's saying, here's what the culture assumes. That this word, he defines it, this sort of made up word of describing homosexual versus heterosexual, is trying to describe this dichotomy, this duality. He says, quote, again, it is further implied from the time of birth, one is fated to be one thing or the other, and that there is little chance for one to change this pattern in the course of a lifetime. So his assumption going in is that there's a false dichotomy, duality, male, female, and there's a false sexual expression as a dichotomy, heterosexual, homosexual. This is where these concepts begin of gender fluidity and gender identity start to take shape, because they're not just the actions we take, they're the psychological makeup of who we are. They're not just the actions of actually taking action on it. We'll see in some of his analysis, he'll talk about homosexual psychology and homosexual activity as a mental state. And there's a whole spectrum he'll start to talk about, which colors the way he interprets the data of how he defines these terms and then normalizes them. So any thoughts on that in terms of his framing of that?
From what I could tell in the book, I didn't really see much emphasis on a idea that gender is on a spectrum, but definitely sexuality. I think the sexuality being on a spectrum is certainly a precursor to what we find with the
it's more a precursor to
postmodernist.
that. Yeah.
I think it's a precursor, and it's also interesting because I think in one sense he has a point insofar as somebody's sexual behaviors and preferences and tastes can be shaped by what they choose to do and what they choose to entertain and how they choose to live. And so, in fact, it's interesting because the idea that you're inherently born this way and there's no way out of it is sort of the arguably not Christian situation where vice and things like that do shape character. And so, but the direction he goes with that idea is obviously not the best. But this again, talking about what is he reacting against, and maybe there's a sliver of truth to what he's saying to some extent. But again, he kind of goes ballistic with that idea and takes it in a direction.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the big wrestling points when we're thinking about people, especially people who are bold enough or brave enough to put their ideas out into the world, is we can't start. And one of the things I love about our show is we don't start with what we call the hermeneutics of suspicion. In other words, we may have our own conclusions based on our own study and our own thinking about where these ideas lead. But in order for people to be taken seriously, you have to take what they say seriously and try to think of the world as they have construed the world, not in the sense in which we agree with it, but in the way in which we can really understand where they're coming from. And if we really understand where Kinsey is coming from, no matter how deleterious the effects of his ideas were, we have to look at it in the sense in which he's saying. And if you start out with the fact that man is no special creation, that he is just another animal in the universe, then you can see how his ideas would have resonance with some people who really take on that evolutionary worldview. If the evolutionary worldview is true, then the reality is man is no different than animals. And if man is no different than animals, then men will live and function in the same way that animals live and function. I mean, and if we take that logic, I mean, I don't know how strictly logical it is, but if we take that seriously, we can see why he made these decisions, why he believes that man is governed by biology and not morality, and that human sexuality is, an evolutionary instinct, and that humans should be determined by their sexual capacities, not by being designed or for a purpose. And since there's no transcendence, there's no imago Dei, there's no external eternal accountability, men can live, according to Kinsey, as they wish. And if that means they want to live these lifestyles that are different than other men, then I mean, on Kinsey's view, I mean, it makes sense if his views are correct. Now, we're going to argue that they are not, but on his view, all is up for grabs.
Mhm.
Every bit of it is.
Yeah. Yeah, well, let's then transition a little bit into the next portion. Look at his ethic and his system that he's trying to bring out through his analysis, through his study. So, and before we even get into the details of that, we can look at his cultural analysis. And this is one thing, Alex, you haven't been on to see these other shows, but we've talked about this in a lot of other shows over the years, is that a lot of times you get these philosophers or practitioners who do a good job of diagnosing the problem, but their prognosis is really what's bad. They can see the challenge, and that's something you kind of brought up earlier with the Victorian concept. They can see the problem in society, but they can't see the solution because their worldview only gives them a certain set of assumptions to work with or presuppositions, and then they end up in the wrong place, even though they might be rightly diagnosing a problem in the culture. So for Kinsey, he assumes the culture, the Victorian kind of context there, the obviously negative view of sexuality, which goes back to really Augustine, that even sex with inside of marriage was seen as a dirty, sort of filthy act. That has really dominated the West and a lot of Roman Catholic theology through the centuries. So there's clearly that part that is built into the culture and sort of privatized or stigmatized even right sex inside of a marriage context. So I think he's seeing that and then just sort of equating everything with that, certainly. But that shaped his view certainly of what he saw as Christian morality. He believed that sort of facts could be self-explanatory, devoid of moral values. Matter of fact, he writes that in the introduction, that I'm going to look at the facts and I'm going to strip it from any moral presuppositions, which in and of itself is a moral presupposition, but he doesn't see it that way. He thinks he's going to be morally neutral. Here's one of the
Right.
things he says that I'll throw back to you, and then we'll come to you after this quote, Alex. It says, Kinsey says this: the social significance of the homosexual is considerably emphasized by the fact that Jewish and Christian churches have considered this aspect of human sexuality to be abnormal and immoral. Social custom and our Anglo-American law are sometimes very severe in penalizing one who is discovered to have had homosexual relations. So that's his modus operandi, beginning point. Alex, let's jump to you.
Yeah, so it's interesting because the Jewish and the Christian, particularly the Christian context in which he's writing in, he says that it views it as immoral and abnormal. And I think the Christian interpretation of these things as immoral is something that was added on to, because he also talks about Greco-Roman society and sexuality, and he tries to use that as in some ways to justify his thesis. But what I think he misses there is that even in Greco-Roman society, these kinds of quote deviancies were not seen necessarily as immoral, but they were seen as abnormal. And the intelligentsia of Greco-Roman society, although it was very common, pederasty and extramarital affairs, it was not seen as good for the society. And so they saw it as abnormal, believe it or not. It was not immoral, but it was not good for the state for this sort of thing uh, to be celebrated as something that's good. And so even they saw that without a Christian worldview. And he's throwing off even that. My point here is he lumps in the view that these perversions are abnormal as simply distinctive of Christianity. But I would say that the view that it's abnormal is not a distinctively Christian view. I think
Mm-hmm.
there is a distinctively Christian view of morality about these things, but not whether or not it's good for the success of the polis.
Yeah. Leroy, jump in. Mm-hmm.
As you guys were talking about it, I was thinking of the angst and the anger that these conversations generate among people. And here's what I find very interesting. Now, in the way that we're having a discussion, I think we're having a discussion quite logically, quite reasonably. We're trying to treat Kinsey respectfully, even though we may disagree with him. Yet the very conversation that we're having is generates so much anger because what's really at stake isn't human sexuality in as much as whether God is actually spoken or not, right? Whether
Mm-hmm.
the scriptures, the way in which it frames man is true or not. And while Kinsey thought that these ideas were repressive, he never really addresses the fact whether they're harmful.
Mm.
Do you see what I mean? He never
Yeah.
really addresses whether they're harmful or destructive.
I think though, Leroy, in his own way, from his perspective, I think he does deal that when we look at his view of human sexuality. When you see it, like, how did he view it, right? That's the next big question. That if he rejected that Christian moral framework, how did he view it? And I think the answer to that is that he said, look, if Christians have these laws and they've put out these rules and they put people in jail like sodomy laws or they socially ostracize, then I need to look at the people that have been marginalized by society, that have been imprisoned for pedophilia, that have been
Hmm.
convicted of these crimes. And I need to look to that group of people to find out what is good or what is right, because I'm going to look at the facts, of course. He sees them as facts, but his really argument is that these aren't destructive. The only reason we think they're destructive is because we have a moral system that says they're destructive. Remember, we
Hmm.
did that with our last show,
Sure.
where we had looking at the cultural anthropology and its shaping, and it said, look, if we can find examples of it being lived out in a society free from Christian morals, we'll see that it's the only reason we think it's destructive is because we're told it is. And so that's why
Yeah.
he's going to then do the studies. And this is where maybe we can bring in some stats of how he looked at this. But he primarily looked at people in prison and people that were on the margins of things. He did studies on little kids as young as 5 months old who were being sexually molested by old men and did like, hey, how were they aroused? And he looked at that arousal, quote unquote, as a normalizing feature, saying, "We'll see if you can have a guy in his 40s arousing a kid that's 3 years old. Clearly, that's natural. That's a normal thing to happen. Therefore, we can conclude, even though society says it's detrimental, it's really not. If we just create the environment where it's accepted, we'll see that it's freeing and it's
Yeah.
empowering, right?"
Yeah, I get no, I get what I get where he's saying. I'm asking a slightly different question. Like if we take his views seriously, of course he is going to cite whatever data or whatever evidence he's discussing in order to explain his position. I'm looking at it in a very different light. I'm asking, does it is it destructive not in terms of his yeah, well, I guess I am looking at it from a moral framework. I guess that is undergirding my perspective that it is destructive from a moral framework. But also, I think it's physically destructive as well. I mean, the 3 or the 4 year old person who's being molested can't object to it, right? I mean, and
Right.
the people that are
Yeah.
being taken advantage. they can't object to it.
Well,
But
in
Yeah.
his
he
in
was
his assumption is because it's a purely biological process, the mental state of objection doesn't exist except for society imposes the mental state of objection. The fact that they can biologically, physiologically respond to sexual stimuli is evidence that it is good for them. He's taking the fact of stimulation as his facts of moral rightness.
yeah. I mean,
Alex,
Right.
Alex, explain. Tell Leroy why he's wrong, why I'm right.
I know you're wrong.
Well, no, I mean, he definitely assumes that harm is only had in some sort of amoral sense where
Yeah.
I guess it's only associated with physical defect or infection and things like that. But he sets aside the idea that these things are psychoses of any type, and that doing these sorts of behaviors, especially to those who can't consent, is going to negatively impact their psyche. So he kind of takes the soul element completely and
Mhm.
discards it, and then he purely looks at stimuli, and his moral framework for what's good simply is that which profits our senses, and not anything else. And I think his assumption about the soul and about human being just an animal contributes to that. Of course, he doesn't ever. I don't think he ever actually asks the question: if we have a society full of files, who's gonna who's gonna have kids and raise them?
Right.
This is a civilizational annihilation type view. If it's really all these
Exactly.
mores go away.
If you've ever counseled a woman who's been taken advantage of by a man, for example, the physiological things that happen during that violence are some of the most harmful things that that woman restates and relives over, and it becomes a tremendous mark of shame. So I don't agree with him. I mean, I know you guys aren't agreeing either, so let me be
Yeah.
clear with that. That just because there's some physical stimuli that takes advantage that happens in that event, that necessarily means that, that the individual is enjoying
Yeah.
it. That makes sense.
Yeah, well,
Uh,
no, and that's the linchpin. That's why I say in the
yeah,
analysis, when we define what's detrimental from a Christian worldview perspective, we're assuming a certain teleology, design of human body and mind, that we can say, okay, just because there's a physiological response doesn't mean that there's a moral good or that there isn't a spiritual
sure,
impact that's negative. He's assuming the spiritual doesn't exist. So if he can show that a 5-year-old can be brought to orgasm, therefore that 5-year-old must be doing what is naturally right to that person. Therefore, it is a moral good. That's the naturalistic assumption
so
that seems to be
so you're
going in,
saying
right?
he's only looking at the physical functions that take place during those events rather than the emotional,
Yeah.
moral, and other deleterious
Yeah.
spiritual. Yeah,
He's treating humans as if they were gall wasps.
Yeah.
exactly.
And another famous, not that we have to sidetrack, but another famous author who does the same shift is Edward O. Wilson, who studied ants, and then he used
Yeah.
that as a precursor to give a whole philosophy of human nature,
Mm-hmm.
society, ethics, and the unity of knowledge. And so I think that was popular in that day, with empiricism being such a large facet of modernism. The quote unquote hard science is supposedly the new magisterium. Now that we've sloughed off the old magisterium of the quote religious elites, and now we have science to rescue us from all that. So yeah, I think he is very much in that mold. It's not good, obviously, but the one thing did want to say though is that as bad as we can talk about, as bad as his views were, they wouldn't have ever taken shape in policy and society if we rejected them,
Right.
but we didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah.
it's not when we not to shortcut to the bottom line here, but when we talk about repentance and societal ills, in one sense, it's we all need to repent, and we're all flavored and shaped by these ideas that our forefathers or the generations before us allowed to become more normative than they should have been.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so how do we make sure that doesn't happen today? I mean, what are the ideas floating around?
Yeah, well, in some sense it is. I wish I should have clipped it. I have the clip. I wish I'd have brought it into my system here. We could show it. I have a TED talk from, I think it's like 4 or 5 years ago now. The woman's talking about, let's not use the word pedophile because that's stigmatizing. And the entire TED talk is about the normalization
Yeah.
of pedophilia. It is exactly what we see here in Kinsey.
Right.
We can look
Mind
at,
attracted person.
yeah, a minor attracted person, right? Because they're looking at the psychological state that we shouldn't vilify that because that's a natural thing. We could look at IVF and how it's being used to commoditize women as baby carriers, and they're paid by couples who are homosexuals to say, okay, you make a baby for us, we'll possess the baby. And so we're purchasing human life in this. And this is what I think Kinsey would have advocated for, in the sense, if you're going to argue as a Christian, well, of course there's a negative societal impact, but that's only because society has a view of it that's driven by this aberrant Christian moral system. If you reverse that system, then we can do away with the negative societal impacts and even the stigmas that certain people feel from that. The only reason those children feel violated is because society tells them they're violated. If we can tell them and raise them to believe that they're okay, then they're okay with it. That was his idea.
And Kinsey, I think one could say that Kinsey was a wacko, and we're always going to have wackos. But the real villains are those who enshrined his ideas into policy and law and spread it through the institutions. So it's one thing to talk about a guy with crazy ideas. It's another thing to really wrestle with the culpability of lawmakers and policymakers who let this become more normative. And also, what was the church doing at that time? Did they adequately launch a counteroffensive? What are the sins that we need to repent from in order to safeguard from this happening again? And your TED Talk, I think I've seen snippets of that. I think is a modern day example of this, potentially becoming the same mistake all over again.
Yeah. Well, and he did this through manipulation of the stats too. We have to make sure we mention this as well, because this is where we start out looking at the stats and how that was shaped by his worldview. But he wouldn't think he's manipulating him. He thinks he argues in the book essentially that we don't have good statistics on how normal and average these activities are, because society has suppressed those things and kept us from finding it. So it's a conspiracy of scientists to keep us from this. So he's sort of arguing that the lack of evidence in the broader culture can be evidenced by looking at these people that are imprisoned or they've been arrested, and then we can extrapolate that data. And here's the way he frames it. Again, this is that trying to say the homosexual heterosexual dichotomy. It's not that dichotomy, and it's not that marginalized as we would be led to think. He says this: it is amazing to observe how many psychologists and psychiatrists have come to believe that homosexual male and females are discretely different from persons who merely have homosexual experiences. So now we're getting to the distinction between activities or identity, although he wouldn't use identity terminology, but he's saying identity versus activity, or who react sometimes to homosexual stimuli. Now that's the children. He's talking about the pedophilic type stuff there. Sometimes such an interpretation allows for only two kinds of males and two kinds of females, namely those who are heterosexual and those who are homosexual. But as subsequent data will show, this is why he's trying to get his data to show a certain thing, there is only about half of the male population whose sexual behavior is exclusively heterosexual. And there are a few percent who are exclusively homosexual. Actually, of course, one must learn to recognize every combination of heterosexuality and homosexuality and the histories of various individuals. Therefore, again, that's where we get the sort of, in modern terminology, the fluidity of these sexual identities isn't really based on one activity or other. If you've ever had a dream about something, if you've ever thought, hey, that's a good looking man. Well, clearly that's on a spectrum. Therefore, I can normalize this through our thoughts. And if we normalize the activity, the people that have those thoughts will feel far more comfortable adapting those lifestyles or those choices, right? That's his framework for doing that. And that's the reason why he could take the data that he took and extrapolate into the broader culture. That does open the door to the idea of guilt and shame, right? So this is where I want to get you guys. We've talked about a little bit. How does he change that cultural framework is really his goal, to change the moral framework for that. And his psychological sections show that kind of bias where he dismisses guilt and shame as outdated religious baggage. He ignores ideas of conscience as part of our God-given moral design. He treats, as you talked about, Leroy, he treated all families as neutral, no matter how dark their. All fantasies as the same thing, as they're all morally neutral, and his sexual orientation continuum. So the Kinsey scale, then reflected his determination to erase clear moral categories and replace them with this concept of fluidity. So how then did you guys read his moral goals or his moral agenda? Any insights from your studies there? Let's go to Alex. We'll go to you first this time.
Yeah, I mean, his agenda seems to be sort of what we've talked about, is to set aside all previous mores and taboos and open the floodgates to indulgence and sensuality and sexuality. And so that really seems to motivate his entire project. I don't think he does mention, or at least in the quotes that I read, he'll say almost all, and it's kind of like, well, which ones are not? And also, if on his view of morality, why is it wrong to set up taboos? I mean, why is it wrong to set up restraints? He's just assuming that um, he really doesn't have anywhere to stand when he labels things right or wrong.
Yeah, there's no boundary condition for those concepts
Yeah,
of taboo. I think we see this in a lot of writers from this area. They'll just say, well, of course there's outliers, of course there's taboos, but they never define what those are, nor do they say how their philosophy would create a standard by which we could measure that. They just want to say that,
yeah,
I think, to be morally persuasive to the culture. Say, hey, don't resist my ideas. I'm not saying everything's okay. And then the hearer
yeah.
can fill in their own expectation, and
Well,
then they can be
yeah.
persuaded, right?
I mean, imagine if somebody said, "Well, I actually find satisfaction in setting up these taboos and sustaining them."
Yeah.
Right? So then he has to say, "Well, that's wrong," and you have to say, "Well, why?" And he'll
Mm-hmm.
say, "Because it limits other people from doing." And it's like, "Well, why does that matter?" So then you're going to go into a utilitarian ethics, and it just that kind of derails pretty quick. But he's not a philosophical thinker, as you say, but then he offers deep philosophical conclusions.
Yeah, I mean that's, but that's his starting point, right? There's no real anchor in reality, and he's just like so many of the other philosophers we've discussed on in this thread or in this discussion, is that they stand outside of reality and they seek to impose their views on reality and never really deal with the consequences of those views. Imagine if there really was no such thing, no guilt. Imagine if guilt wasn't a good thing, right?
Mhm.
Then boy, I could justify any behavior that I want to carry out. Oh, if it takes advantage of you, I don't need to feel guilty about that, or that it's wrong. I don't really need to feel anything. I mean, for Kinsey, guilt was just cultural program. But what if you have a whole culture full of suicidal, murderous maniacs? You
Mm.
know what I mean?
Yeah.
What do you do? What do you do? I mean,
Well, that's a good point. Let's bring this into the present then a little bit. And we can
yeah.
still kind of salt in some quotes or some evidences from his book. But I'm curious then how, when you look at his view of manhood, of masculinity, of sexuality, where do we see that in the culture today? Maybe even in the church or maybe other places. Obviously, there's that is ought fallacy that he brings in. What is observable is right or good. We see that played out. But I'm curious where you guys might see this active in the culture so that people can see, hey, when you're looking at this and you're hearing this speaker, you read this book, or you're watching this television show, this is where this book you've never read, this 800 and some pages, and a study that even today people say, oh, of course it was flawed, and of course it has challenges, but yet the ideology, the philosophy that's behind it is still quite vibrant. Where
Mhm.
do you guys see that? What should we be looking out for? Leroy,
Um,
will go with
college,
you first.
college campuses are are the place where you see the ideas expressed and the ideas wrestled with. I mean, we look at so many speakers who go on the college campuses or people who go where students are and they try to raise a different standard or a different worldview than what they've learned or what they're living, and you see the anger and the angst that represents. I mean, that's the place where it's probably most visible in terms of where the discussion is being had and where it's at. But you also see it in our public policy, where parents no longer have a say so in the way that their children can be raised and how their children ought to live. Parents no longer have a say so. The state has jumped in and imposes its views on parents in many cases, especially here in California where we live at, and in other states. You see these ideas lived out, and ultimately what you see is the state's ethics, sexual ethics, being exerted over the parents and the individual's sexual ethics. We're not allowed to talk to people, young people, about their sexual ethics or sexual views. You'll go to jail if you do, and especially if you're deemed as trying to change them. So, I mean, it's this guy's ideas are. I mean, he's been in the grave for decades, and his ideas are being lived out in the world today in radical ways.
Yeah. Alice, what do you think,
Yeah.
man? You're a man of the world. You're an Oxford
Yeah.
educated, brilliant scholar. What do you say?
Well, I think that some of the examples we see today are even high school curriculum and on sexual behavior, including things like how to properly use sexual toys. And the argument is, well, they're going to do it anyway, so we need to tell them how to do it properly, or we need to free them from whatever restraints they might falsely have had. And really, what we see is an inversion of the pre-modern concept of human, the goal of human nature, the goal of human existence, and really what virtue is. Virtue is, or at least consists in bringing into proper order our passions in accordance with reason. And now, under Kinsey's influence, virtue is either just not really acknowledged or it's been inverted into the opposite of letting the passions run wild and enabling others to do the same. And so I also say that we're also seeing on the what we could call the far left trying to normalize polyamory,
Mm-hmm.
and we all, well, this is the interesting bit, is we're in some sectors of the far right, quote unquote, we're seeing normalization or an attempted normalization of polygamy. And so it's again,
Yeah.
it's
Did you
two
see, by
sides
the way, I
of the
don't
same
mean to
coin.
interrupt you, but did you see I've seen on X recently there's some pastors. I'm a Christian pastor and here's my multiple wives and the Bible never
Right.
condemns it, right? That's kind of what you're
So
alluding to. Have you seen those?
right. Yeah, I have. And so what basically the polyamorists are saying, well, nature doesn't really exist, and the only thing that's real is my sensations. And the polygamists are saying, no, nature does exist, and in order to maximize output, we should normalize polygamy. So
Mm-hmm.
rather than taking into account the fallenness of our nature and the goal of human existence to worship God and glorify Him and cultivate the virtues, which requires a lot of self constraint. Both sides are kind of discarding with that in different ways, and we need to not fall into the trap of another false dichotomy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the right is using it to demonstrate their virility, right? That's exactly. I'm able to handle more than one
Right.
women, and even those who don't get married are using it to collect harems for themselves on the far right, right? That could create harems
Yes.
for themselves,
Yes.
and none of this is good for society, right? None of
Mm-hmm.
it is.
Right. Right. There's a great article out there that talks about how monogamy is a sort of a societal technology of advancement, and the reasons for that are multifaceted. But the point there being that when you do have your passions properly ordered in accordance with reason on a civilizational scale, it brings about great civilizational progress. And when you
Flourishing.
dissolve that and disintegrate it, we're going to bring about great civilizational harm.
Yeah, I read an article about that. I think there's a book out. I haven't read it yet, but it's on my list of things. But it talks about tying monogamy to Western advance and civilizational advance. I think that's probably what you probably
Absolutely.
referring to. It actually
Yeah.
traces that the reason why some of these other places didn't advance is because of the polygamous nature of the society kept them from making certain advancements, which is really interesting because I don't think people
Yes.
realize how much when they trust what is the natural world to determine what is ought, what they're really opening the door to, and they can't find a way out from the problems they create. When I was doing my PhD, I came across this really interesting article in a journal, and the article was two authors talking about the biological evolutionary usefulness of rape. And the whole point was they're going to say, well, of course it's wrong today, but at the end they can't agree why it's wrong. But what they both agreed on as naturalists, not Christians, has said there was a point where there was an evolutionary advantage to this, that it allowed the species to survive and move forward. We don't need that anymore because we've technologically advanced beyond it. But what they couldn't say is that it was actually wrong.
Hmm.
They couldn't say that it was actually bad. It was just sort of it's no longer necessary because we have technology that makes that not necessary for our species to advance. But if we
Yeah.
have a giant Cold War or a giant war and somebody puts an EMP and we're going back to it, then well, maybe it'll be necessary again. This is the
Right.
problem that they can't get through, right?
Right.
Yeah, and
Right.
notice how regressive it is. I mean, the ideas are completely regressive. I mean, they talk about it being progressive. No, it's not progress. It's regress.
No.
We're going back to the so-called Stone Age. We're going back to where laws don't matter anymore. We're going back to the pagan era where any and everything goes. This is not progress. This is regress. This is why those civilizations are all off the map now. That's exactly why.
Yeah, and it's an interesting on some views of kind of. I know we some of your questions views of the end and final judgment and whatnot. The the view of heaven and hell and final judgment is God giving those what they want.
Mm,
Yeah.
These
hmm
people really want to live in chaos forever and the completely disordered existences, and God gives them exactly that. And it's a shame when we have enshrined in our institutions certain norms that catalyze that sort of thinking to make it more common.
hmm Well, I think one of the reasons why this is such an appealing philosophy to many, especially young people, is because we are so divorced from nature. Our
Hmm.
city living, our lifestyles that we live, very much advanced through technology that we don't really see that how brutal nature is. I remember watching the science shows when I was a kid, and the tigers and lions would chase these antelope down and they'd kill them and all this sort of thing. I was like, whoa, that's so crazy. But if you watch Survivor, the TV show, we've watched that for years. We love it. But they give them these chickens, and these people all want to eat the chicken, but they can't bring themselves to kill the chicken. And so somebody says, okay, I'll do it. I've never done it, but they're willing to do it because they grew up in a city. They've never touched a live chicken before, but they'll do it because they're starving. But then the other people who gladly eat the chicken will talk bad about the person. I can't believe he was so evil and
Yeah,
brutal to kill the chicken that he would do that. And I'm going to vote him off next time. I'm going to get rid of this guy because I can't believe he'd do that. But I'm thankful that he did it so I could eat, but it's evil that he did it. Right. This is the kind of thing we open ourselves up to when we say, well, nature is our standard, the is and the ought. Weicker tells a story in his book that this is worth telling. It's a sort of an extended analogy that kind of connects with the story I brought up earlier about that article on the history, the evolutionary value of rape stuff. He said this: his world was the Kinsey worldview assumption is the is ought should be the is the ought, right? But he says in his book, as I mentioned before, I was purified of my romantic notions of roosters and hens by raising them in our backyard. So again, city guy goes, I'm gonna homestead, right? We get this a lot, this homesteading movement today, but they don't realize what it actually means because they've never been on a farm. But he says, I was raising them in the backyard before experiencing how roosters actually act. My vision of a normal rooster was fashioned by Walt Disney's generally rose-colored view of animals. All of us were quite scandalized to find out that real roosters have not a pin feather of chivalry. The rooster's idea of romance is to savagely and regularly leap upon the ladies and rip their back feathers out with his beak, while rudely having his way. After several weeks of listening to the hen's pain-filled shrieks, we moved the roosters into our freezer. Reality was the cure for our romantic notions. I think that's just so funny. Moved them into our freezer. Anyway, the is of roosters was too much to bear, but we had given up on any notion of them changing their ways to what they ought to be. And that's the framework that we have to look at. And maybe to close this up, Alex, I want to come back to that Victorian notion that you said sort of dominated, that maybe Kinsey was rightly pushing back against, that saw all sexuality as bad and wicked, which again, Augustine sort of reinforced and Roman Catholic Church embedded in the culture. And so that is up. But once we strip away everything else, we go back to what nature really is. We realize, okay, maybe that's not the solution that I thought it was. Maybe the guardrails have created a false idea of what is sin or what is bad, but maybe ripping off every guardrail isn't the solution. So where I want us to go is where do we go with Christian men? Because we see the Andrew Tates of the world taking rise, the Christian polygamy starting to have some influence. We see the Nick Fuenteses of the world, not just for their view of anti-Semitism, but also the view of male dominance and sexuality. That's having appeal with people. It's almost like the pushback in the opposite direction to the Kinseyan worldview. Where do Christian men find our identity? What is a healthy Christian male sexuality? Where do we go from here? So, Leroy, I'll jump in with you first. I know Alex probably has good things to say, but I'll make you to go first on that one.
Alex has nothing good to say.
Oh,
No, I'm
Oh,
kidding.
sometimes.
Sometimes. No, it's like we talked about starting points. What's our starting point? I mean, if our starting point is to be a man in the culture, a cultural denizen, to be whatever the culture deems, I mean, then boy, that's a model and mix. I mean, you're either a toxic male or you're a beta male or you're a sigma male or some other male, right? That's the cultural ethos. Well, I think we have to ask, where do these all lead? I mean, what good do they all do for the individual, right? And when we begin to think that through, it's the, as we keep talking about all day, the is-ought fallacy. There really is no right way to be for man in the world if we take Kinsey's view seriously. You just exist in whatever realm that makes you happy. But if there is an external ought, an ought to which we ought to rise and become, then our life takes on a different meaning, a different standard. So, for example, to be a young man in the world is not to be a perfect man in the world, right? Because there's only one of those people that has existed, but it is to be a man, as Alex said, and C.S. Lewis said long before him, whose reason and passions and desires are in line with the way in which the world actually works. Um, and in that sense, to pursue virtue, to pursue goodness, and to pursue kindness, and to pursue toughness, and to pursue sacrifice, and to pursue um, uh, skill and study and diligence and passion, and to really pursue those things as if they are really meaningful things, really meaningful ideas, really meaningful ways in which to be in the world. And then at the end of your life, at the end of the life, you will see that you lived a life of meaning, that you will have lived a life where you've impacted people whose lives matter, whose children reflect the impact that you've had. But you won't get that if you're the sigma male, if you consider yourself the beta male, if you consider yourself any kind of construal that the world, and what I mean by the world, I mean our culture actually tries to foist on you. um, you have to look at the end, I think. and then find examples of people who are who are really living that out, and seek wisdom from them, and pursue it with all your heart.
Yeah. Alex,
Yeah.
man, jump in. What do men need to know? What do Christian men need to know?
Yeah, I would say that the Christian man needs to know that living the Christian life is extremely difficult and it's challenging and it's a struggle, but the goal is to struggle in the right things and in the right way. So being a husband of one wife, that's difficult. That takes work. That takes actual trial you have to overcome vice, and you have to say no to your desires to raise kids in a faithful way in a Christian household. That takes endurance. It takes a lot of conquest in many ways. First and foremost, against your own vice, and then to just have the long suffering love for broken people who live in your household. To be an active member of your church and to put the things of God first is difficult, and it takes a lot of courage and it takes a lot of strength. And so this idea that the Christian experience is some sort of Ned Flanders milk toast sort of thing is extremely misplaced. The Christian experience is that of courage and that of a warrior, really. And so Christian men should not be disillusioned into thinking that the Christian life that's been handed down to us is something to be seen as weakness or anything like that. It takes very much the opposite of weakness to be faithful to your family and to God. And in this culture, if this scratches any itch, it's also extremely rebellious to be doing those sorts of things. To
Mhm.
say no to all these invitations to indulgence when everyone else is doing it, you're the one rebelling against that. And so I would just say to not be hoodwinked into Kinsey's ideology or the ideology of the culture around us, and instead embrace true masculinity, which is being faithful to what God has given you and putting Him first and foremost.
I would say my big thought on that is that the church needs to do a much better job of creating good boundaries, right boundaries that allow men to flourish as God has designed them to flourish. There's an illustration that I remember hearing years ago, and I wish I could give attribution where I heard it, but I think it's really appropriate here. It's the idea that you take a group of children and they're playing on a giant hilltop, and there's just you
You
just
know,
helicopter them in. Right? Do you know where this came from? I
yep.
think we talked about it before. Remind me where, because I want to give attribution if I can.
Orthodoxy, G.K. Chesterton's.
Oh, that's where it was. Okay, yeah, you're right. So we helicopter these kids in. They're on a mountaintop. There's just all cliffs on every side, and you can give them all the balls and all the tools and all the things to play with, but they're all going to huddle right in the middle of that thing because they're afraid of falling off the edge of the cliff. But you build a wall around that, and they're going to be bouncing off the walls. They're going to be playing freely. They're going to experience the joy of play because they know that they're safe within that. And I think what the culture says when we remove all these boundaries, we become afraid, and so then we're looking for anybody who can tell me there's clarity. Just give me some clarity. Just give me a boundary. And if the boundary is polyamory or whatever it is, they'll say, at least I know. At least now I have some direction. And so because we're rudderless in the church, or we've adopted this sort of view of sexuality as, well, it's mostly bad, but you have to do it to kind of reproduce. And there's that negative Victorian Augustinian sense to it. Then you're not going to see that as freeing, allowing us to enjoy what God has created us to enjoy. I was just talking about this in my class just this last week with my students, mostly freshmen, and explaining to them, because when you have these different views of how God has designed us, male and female, and for that purpose, we realize that the act of sex was created by God. If it's within that marital bounds, it's actually an act of worship. It's
Mm-hmm.
actually an act of celebrating the goodness and the virtue of God. Outside of that, it is wrong, but not because the thing itself is wrong. Right? It's meant to be a pleasurable experience. It's meant to be all those things, but when we defile that in some other way, or we don't have clear boundaries, then we just left to fill in the gaps ourselves. And I think my big thing is for men is that we need those healthy boundaries, biblical boundaries, to know where even like a guy like Kinsey could see the errors in the culture, but we need to give the right diagnosis and the prognosis. And that's the end we have to go to. So, hey, let's wrap this up. Any last final thought? Or I appreciate you guys, your time carving this out. Alex, we'll start with you. Any kind of final thoughts as we close this up?
No, I think you put it really well when you talk about boundaries. Chesterton, I think the quote was something like, before you tear down a fence, you should ask why it was put up in the first place. And Joe, yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. Putting up the fences and reinforcing the ones that are there can safeguard both extremes, right? Both extremes. So I just want to emphasize that being important, and just emphasize really everything else we've said, really namely that the Christian life it's not easy, and it's not to be taken lightly. It takes a lot of courage, and men should feel the most masculine when they're living in accordance with Christian teaching.
Yeah, I've always thought about it this way. Real freedom is not the ability to say yes. It's the ability to say no. That's what real freedom is. And to be a man today, a man who loves God and loves his neighbors and loves his family, you have to say no to some things, right? You have to say no to some things. And if you can't say no, then you're a slave to that thing. So if you really want to be free, the kind of freedom that Kinsey promised but could never deliver, pursue God with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding, but all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths.
Amen to that. Amen to that, brother. Well, again, thank you guys so much for joining us today on Raised Roof. There's so much more that we could say about Kinsey and his work and how it impacted our culture and even our sense of what it means to be a man. But I want to encourage all of you, brothers and sisters, go out, till the soil of culture so that you can raise the roof on these aberrant sexualities. And I hope you'll come back, join me in the next episode. In the meantime, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And if you want to participate with me in a subscribers only question and answer, you can join me on my website, morethancake.org.